Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's Grid Talk. Delighted to be joined by Professor Joe O'Mahony. Welcome again, Joe. We'll do some intros in a moment. And just to say, a huge welcome. I know we've got a number of new faces on this one, as well as a whole load of regulars. So for all of those of you coming into the Grid Talk series for the first time, fantastic to see you. Okay, I'm going to get going because in some ways, I think the perfect form for this would be a long form podcast at some time, Joe, because already we know there's probably a lot that we can cover, and we are going to stick to the hour discipline. So I'm going to keep the pace up. Again, for those of you that are completely new to what this is, we essentially have a monthly session like this. We call it the Grid Talk series, and it was born out of a real spirit of trying to join up a number of our clients, really to facilitate as best we can the sharing of best practice in the area that we're involved in. And in the spirit, we love having sort of external experts and clients and people like Joe on the series. Just as a sort of look forward, the next monthly one is actually going to be in person, and twice a year we actually seek to gather the troops across our client base. And delighted to say the next one will take place in London, so hopefully that facilitates everybody coming there. If you're interested, I know my colleague will put some information in the chat. Actually, just to say, by way of orientation to the platform, for those of you who haven't seen it, if you just look down onto the bottom right, you can see there's a chat on the far right, and then one along from that is questions. So as we go, and I'm sure there will be, please throw questions onto the question part of that. You can up and down vote as well. So at some point, Joe, hopefully we'll get to sort of plenary Q&A that's coming in. But yeah, next one, Grid Talk live in London. Please let us know if you would like an invite to that. Promises to be a it's a full day, very engaging agenda there for the whole day. Right, well, simply put, I'm the CEO of Method Grid. I think more interestingly, Professor Joe, Professor of Consulting, and I think you're probably one of those jobs where there's probably only very few in the world, actually. If not, you may be the only one, as far as I'm aware.
I think I might be. I murdered the other one so that I could claim the rights.
But also, and hopefully it's pretty obvious from the title there, the consultant's consultant, providing a lot of advisory to ambitious professional service firm leaders, I guess. Joe, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I spent half my time at the university writing, researching and teaching about consultancy, and I spend the rest of my time advising boutique leaders on growth and exit. So I've been doing that for 20 years. So I'm not necessarily someone you'd invite to a dinner party, but I know my stuff when it comes to consulting, or at least I think I do. I'm always surprised by some of my clients.
I would really validate that. I think every exchange I've had with Joe has always been very thought-provoking. I think some of the material that goes out on Joe's LinkedIn channel particularly is very engaging. So yeah, I'd really commend you to
thank you.
Take a look at that. Great. So I mean, this just by way of very quick orientation of where this particular Grid Talk is going to land in our sort of world, and I guess without getting remotely salesy, just to position it for those of you who are new. Fundamentally, Method Grid at its core is an AI-empowered knowledge and project management platform. We have a whole load of professional services that sort of wraps around that, but that's the sort of core. And the fundamental kind of world, I guess, we work into is the AEC sector, and particularly the engineering consultancy nexus. You can see some of the clients and relative, public sector kind of guardians of big capital program offices as well. So that's our kind of world. I mean, this schematic here is really just saying if we had to very simply bundle the kind of common requirement statement for the requirement we address, it would be that the variation of professional service or project delivery is just too broad. Numerous pain symptoms will sort of manifest if that is the case, but effectively we sort of then address that by looking at these four holistically, these four sort of views on the world. And you can see the four columns there. One is, well, firstly, you need real clarity around how you deliver your service methodologically. Point one. Point two, there clearly has to be a compliance regime that's aligned to that. Three is all things to do with the sort of nurturing of the professional community of practice. And then four as you can see from some of our clients there, the world they're working in is inherently very, very multidimensional, high risk, and you can't wish that away, but you can ameliorate it to optimal extent with, well-organized assurance and audit that's linked back to your clear methods. I say all of that just to signpost that today this grid talk is probably a little bit of one. Method clarity is obviously in the knowledge management bucket, but probably primarily in that third. How do you optimally enable a community of professional service practitioners? And then the final one, which is really more the architecture of the platform itself. We have these four discrete areas. I think what we're focusing on today is this final one, which is, if you've developed methodological playbooks, you use those to deliver in practice, as configured to the local circumstance. Each time you go through that sort of delivery experiential loop, you're able to accrete, take new knowledge and feed it back into an ever improving master. So I guess the grid enhance aspect of what we're doing is particularly opposite to knowledge management. But I say all of that just to as I say, navigate us into the topic for today, which is all things knowledge management. And as we set up some of the trailer for this, there's a number of different angles we can clearly take. We're also going to just, as I say, we're going to leave at least 15-20 minutes at the end. So if your questions do come in, we'll get to those. But initially, we're just going to have a bit of an exchange. And what I learned from Joe very quickly is that there was no prep for this call. I don't think either of our diaries particularly accommodated that, but I think we both agreed better to just go completely authentic and see where the exchange takes us. So I do have some potential visual schematics on our side we can jump to if the conversation goes there. But we'll unpack this in a sort of dynamic way. But I'm going to start, I guess, and we've got some questions that came in from a number of people as to where we could go. But Joe, I'm going to start just so we set out the territory by asking you what your history, your career has involved with respect to knowledge management, and at least then we've got some signposts we might jump back to.
Okay, great, thank you. And thanks for the introduction, Dom. Appreciate it. So just a quick background. I did my first degree in Oxford in Greek history, couldn't get a job, so went into businessy stuff. I did my PhD, which actually started to look at knowledge management, but without the consulting perspective, more generally in professional service firms. And then from there started to write, I went into consulting, and I ended up in effect doing knowledge management without knowing knowledge management was an industry. I was designing the mobile phone company from scratch, and I ran the team that did the business and digital architecture for 3. And obviously there, especially when you're dealing with a startup, you've got to balance innovation with also standardization, building the processes from scratch and then internationalizing those processes. We developed our own methodology for doing that, which in effect was a business process management methodology. But obviously, given the sector we were in, it was important to balance innovation because, we were dealing with technology that had never been seen before and enablers that hadn't been seen before. So that was kind of me being thrown into the deep end of it. And then moving into academia, I've written a fair bit about the process of commodification of management knowledge for consultancies and how important that is for a lot of consultancies, especially as a value driver. Now, with my clients, since I've spent 20 years doing advisory work, obviously I have my buyer's hat on. So if I'm buying or advising your company or investing in your company, one of the top 3 things that people look for is intellectual property. And a big part of intellectual property is knowledge management. And so we always have a good, thorough going through of processes, standards, methods, templates, even, tick boxes that can help people perform better and perform more consistently. But this helps. You can typically add an extra multiple on if you've got a strong knowledge management system, because from a buyer's perspective, it helps de-risk the company because you're not dependent on people.
No, great. And just to sort of reciprocate, and that hugely resonates. But let me give a very, very quick canter. So my first degree, also in a bit of a slightly curious bookend, was computer studies 35 years ago, and actually involved research. It was a pretty much preeminent professor at the time, happened to be at my faculty, who was pushing AI at the time, and I sort of latched onto him. Clearly 35 years ago, he was going down completely false alleys, but notwithstanding it, it was thoroughly fascinating. Fast forward 10 years, when I joined Deloitte Consulting, coming out of the military, I did it via a distance learning MBA with the Open University, which I'm a huge fan of. And actually, one of the modules that I really enjoyed was the sort of knowledge management module. And I used it actually to sort of help me find my feet in the practice at Deloitte, and that practice was probably circa 80 people. I wrote the knowledge management strategy for that practice area and became a sort of a vanguard unit of the Deloitte Consulting at the time, which I found super interesting. When I set my own business up, which was sort of early noughties, I then sort of essentially took that and applied it in practice with my own business. And I would happily jump in more to the why it was right at the nub of our ability to sort of build, scale, and ultimately derive value from that, consultancy firm. Sold my firm. I went into a bit of, I guess, similar to your world, Joe. I was sort of at one point advisory, selling boards, multiple companies, running events for sort of PS firm leaders, and it really struck me. I mean, this was over the course of probably 5, 6, 7 years that I spoke to hundreds of professional service firm leaders, invariably very, very smart, driven people. That's the sort of the nature of the industry we're in. All conceptually really understand the importance of knowledge management. It's not a controversial kind of point, but so rarely got beyond fairly badly organized SharePoint and a cluster of PowerPoint decks. And
yep.
I found it fascinating that there was this kind of disconnect with the theoretical benefit and the practical application. That was really, I guess, the twinkle in the eye for MetaGrids. So, coming, I guess, further forward, the experiences of, working with a whole load of clients, with the MetaGrids hat on. The final little curious bit is I did a second degree slightly accidentally in philosophy or PPE, and I loved the philosophy of knowledge component of that. So,
right. We can talk about this. Right. Good.
Takes us off into a sort of slightly sidebar, but that was another kind of curiosity. But so we've got a whole load of signposts there, Joe. Before we get going, though, and I'm going to throw another question at you, I guess we should just agree what this is all about. And I mean, I came across this definition, as you can see, it's old. I think for me, we don't need to spend too much time on this. That was a great arms around, what we're talking about here, and particularly the point that it links to business value and through the whole life cycle of the knowledge creation, use, etc.
Yep.
Are you happy with that, Joe? I don't think it was a massively contentious definition.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I think the value is the key word there, and obviously different consultancies and different clients will define that value in different ways. And I think as we've discussed, aligning your knowledge management strategy to how that is defined is important.
Let's tuck a bit more into that question, I guess, which is the sort of top one there. Why do we claim it as such a central pillar to overall effectiveness and value? What are you seeing that validates that point?
So I ask my MBA students and my exec ed students how to, given Meister's model of leverage multiplied by utilization multiplied by fees. I tell them I ask them how you increase the consultancy's profit per partner, and they'll say, oh, you put up the prices, or you increase the leverage ratio, or you suppress wages. And I say, well, let's think about the consequences of that. And they say, oh, well, you break the firm, because you decrease wages, good people leave. You increase leverage ratio, you've got a very different type of company, people might leave. And anything you do that's obvious, you're going to lose clients or whatever. So how do you do it without breaking the company? Well, one of the key ways is to seek strategic advantage in the way you share, use, and innovate your knowledge so that you provide better value to clients, you provide more consistent delivery, you have a shorter onboarding period for consultants, and you can get to expertise quickly, whether that's a computer or a person or an asset. So all of these things together produce value for the company and value for the clients if they're done properly, and that's the key question, which from my client's perspective means you get a better valuation. So very often people have a CRM system and they might have a PSA system, but that doesn't mean that you've got a knowledge management strategy or system that works.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just to latch onto and Meister, by the way, if people haven't referenced that or heard that before, that is a really seminal, probably 30-year-old book now.
Yep.
But rarely been bettered actually, just in terms of what are the fundamental economics for a PS firm. And actually, one of the things Meister talks about, he builds on the DuPont formula for what is the fundamental, almost mathematical truism of a PS firm. And within that is things like clearly leverage, utilization, but one is fundamentally just strategic core value of your, you can strip it down to say what's your day rate, and permission to build day rate and move from a fairly contractual body shop type kind of play to a genuine consulting high level strategic advisory. Permission to sort of move your day rate north is, for me, hey, there you go, is totally about how much IP knowledge are you actually bringing to bear as well.
Yeah.
I love that. I guess my kind of my riff on it, Joe, would be I felt it most viscerally, I guess, building my own firm. There's one thing about learned the kind of theory, but and if I was honest, I was quite lucky in that the first client we had was Transport for London, and we sort of had the privileged engagement of helping to build methodological clarity and capability for that organisation. And went down probably a number of false alleys about how to do it optimally, but landed eventually on a very powerful approach. And I took part of that learning back into my firm, but again, I've mentioned, I was also really engaged in the topic of knowledge management from some of my sort of professional development. And the bit that I can reflect on was some of those points you made. We invested heavily in building out methodological clarity, but also the more human side of the equation, the sort of people to people kind of facilitation you're trying to do. And what that sort of enabled us to do was to genuinely recruit and scale much in a much faster way, because we had a way of quickly onboarding new joiners into the firm. Became revenue productive much faster than would be, I think, normally the case. We had a brilliant mechanism for advocating our services and explaining the depth of our expertise to clients, because it was manifest. We could open up our toolbox. I was always, as a small firm, pitching against the big guys, and I only hired from the big guys, so I knew what the big guys would be playing, which is a PowerPoint deck. But whenever we went to a prospect client, and they might say, "Well, who on earth are you? We've never heard of you." I'd say, "Look, we're genuine experts, but the only way you are going to validate that is get beyond everybody's website and soundbite. Look at what our genuine expertise and toolboxing is. I'll happily show you mine, and we'll open up a really deep kind of developed set of IP. I know if you ask those guys, you're going to get a slide deck. If you pressure test it, they might give you one more slide deck, but it ain't going much further than that." And it just helped us win work, fundamentally. And then CPD hinged around it, that kind of investment. But when we ultimately came to sell, and BT came through that exercise, and Joe, you've probably got a lot of expertise here, that the buyer comes all, for those kind of businesses, all over the sort of internal architecture, foundations of the firm. And when BT saw the investment in our IP, fundamentally they knew they could get nowhere near it. They would never be able to build anything like it. And it was a huge component of the multiple that led to the valuation of the business. Yeah, so I guess I feel it quite emotionally through that sort of how it eased that journey.
Yep.
Should we talk a bit more about strategy? What's your thoughts on, I guess, the optimal application of sort of knowledge management strategy? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, as we're talking about David Meister, I've in my own book I updated his. So he had kind of had a tripartite division of consulting firm strategy, which he said process, grey hair, and brains. And so brains are solving problems that are new to the client, but also new to the consultancy. You staff yourself full of very bright people who think out of the box. Procedure or process, you're fairly standardized. You might be a managed services or a process-based firm. And then grey hair, where it's based on experience, and you're typically solving a problem that is new to the client, but it's not new to you because you've seen it hundreds of times before. Typically, they have older, more experienced people. Something like Project One would be a good example of that. I added to that by sort of adding on the commodity side of things, which is more of the IT enabled consulting. Sometimes consulting, sometimes SaaS, but each one of those has a different knowledge management strategy. Now, I would say 90% of the clients I've had over the years would say, well, we're part process and we're part experience. And so it's never a pure play, but just ensuring that your knowledge management strategy in terms of how do we add value to the clients and how do we add value internally is aligned to that. Because if you're solving one-off unique problems and you're a brains firm, there's no point having a very highly, tightly defined set of principles of how you do something. And even in the more experienced firms, and very often you'll get reluctance from senior people to add to the IP database with the grey-haired firms, because they'll say, well, I can't define what I do. It's down to experience. And that's very often a challenge for those types of firms and for partners generally. Often I think actually it's because they can't be asked to write it down, in which case I get them to record things because I think that's a lot more amenable to them. But it's very much aligning one of those strategies or one or more of those strategies with what your knowledge management strategy is, what your people management strategy is, and so on. So it's having that consistent strategy going through all aspects of the firm. So that's where I start off from.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually, just sidebar, when you mentioned grey hair, obviously in the context of Meister's kind of model, but I sort of figured the other day, which is just in the say we're in the engineering world quite a lot now, but there are of their sort of demographic in the engineering community, over 30% are now above the age of 55. So they've got this huge chunk of knowledge that's about to leave, the sector in the next 5 years, and the challenge, to what degree can that be captured? I'm just going to build on something there as well, Joe, which is something I've used before. In fact, I wrote a small series of blogs on the topic of knowledge management a few years back, and my colleague could probably put a pointer to that blog series up in the channel, but yeah, I totally reinforced that kind of point. And this was something interesting. I think it was a guy called Hansen put this kind of point out. Hansen, and he said, look, well, firstly, have a strategy, I guess, is an advocation. There's many firms that don't, but if you are genuinely deliberate about this, almost like the first question you have is, what's your lean in? And this is a continuum, but at one end, Hansen called it codification, is you really fixate on the sort of linking people to artifact and knowledge. I guess that's more the sort of the procedural end of Meister's.
Yes.
If you're more at the brains end, you might want to lean towards the sort of personalization strategy, which is really fixated on people-to-people kind of connectivity and the social aspect of it. I mean, this may surprise you. We're a tech business, but I actually still, lean to the personalization end of this continuum. I just think you would always have to have really enabling technology even within that strategy. But it's quite seductive to say we're going to do both really well. But I do think you need to sort of have a deliberate, mild at least asymmetry. So yeah, I think that's another sort of fundamental aspect about strategy is to set the stall out in that regard. Any build on that, Joe, from your side?
Yeah, so I agree with this. I think I prefer a tripartite or even a four segments to it, because I do think it's important to differentiate between one-off unique problems and problems that have been seen many times before, and I think that determines a different type of knowledge. But it also shows you how, I think Hansen wrote this 2000, I could be wrong, it might be 2003, but the companies he names here, the McKinseys, Bains and Bostons, in terms of personalization, they're not personalized anymore. They in order to maximize their revenue, because obviously there's been pressure on consulting margins, they've gone down the codification route. And so now if you join, I had a chat with one of the partners at Bain recently, and I said, what advice would you give to one of my students who was starting? And he said, follow our process. We've spent, 100 years building the process. Follow it. Don't think outside. And I was really shocked. But if you look at what happens to MBAs now when they start, they're given, in effect, a handbook of how to operate. So I'm seeing much more personalization in the boutiques. And I think that's why a lot of clients are going to boutiques, because I think the big firms have become so commodified that the client isn't getting the level of personalization that they want, or at least for the price they want.
Yeah, no, I think that's an absolutely fair point. I think those examples are actually dated. Just to sort of, I guess, bring it to life in a kind of practical way, and I guess this is a slight reference to, I mentioned the sort of initial strategy I wrote for the Deloitte practice, but it was kind of effectively how we brought it into the Moorhouse kind of capability builds. And in terms of the personalization focus for us, which is one of the levers, we used to do things like every time we gathered as a team quarterly, and in and of itself, that was part of that strategy, was every quarter we should make the investment just to get people into a co-located place. And a key part of that sort of then time investment was we used to do what we called knowledge fairs, which was everybody come back from their engagement and literally set it up like a fair. You had a table in a big room, get your laptops out and put your posters up and get all of your deliverables out on the table of the work you are doing. And, at the point when we were, in sort of good, we were growing business, there might be 20 different engagements that are out talking. And I, even as the MD, I would walk around and go, I had no idea you guys were doing that. And you need to go and chat to, Tracy over there, because, this is very joined up. But that was an example of something that was really emphasizing the people to people connection. And, we would say, we had a little rubric. We would say, we always want, clearly there's a point of scale where this gets challenging, but we want 90% of the firm to know 90% of the firm at a level of detail that you would say, right, I know now I should be picking up the phone to Joe because he's been doing work in this area. I need to speak to him. Clearly, massive global firms, that's constrained to sort of business units, professional communities, but that was a component of that.
Yeah, I agree completely with your, and as you say, it's quite surprising that, given the firm you run, you emphasize the people part of it, but they're not mutually exclusive, of course. With any of these types of problems, I always take the McKinsey approach: people, process, and technology. You need the process by perhaps each month you have the monthly fairs and you have processes for keeping in contact, but you need the cultural side of it. I think Rachel Wattstein just a minute ago said, well, there's no use having this stuff if nobody uses. And that's part of the culture. It's communication, it's leadership, it's aligning your priorities and incentives so that people do use this stuff and see the benefit of it. But also, you've got to look at the technological side of it. So you've got people, process, technology. And if you ignore any one of those, it's a route to partial failure, I would say.
No, absolutely. I think, where we see best practice a little bit more with the method grid hat on is where, organizations are sort of really investing in developing their methodological base, but their methodology completely embedded within it is saying, look, we signpost you to, Bill, Sarah, and Jane if you're kind of needing more help in this particular area, and you're using it as a way of enabling the, also the personalization approach.
Can I just add to that something that I think is quite important? The link from knowledge management to strategy is two ways. So what I would often find is that if I'm so, knowledge management is quite easy if you've got a boutique of 20. When you move to 50, and you don't, as the owner, you don't have oversight of everything. You can't control every output, and you can't train everyone individually or mentor them individually. It's a different kettle of fish. So when I go into a firm, they'll often say something along the lines of, well, we want to increase our IP, and then you start to standardize it, and then you'll get pushback saying, oh no, well, this is too standardized because this client over here wants something and this client over here wants something else. Now, at which point you have to have the serious conversation about what type of firm do you want to be? Do you want to offer 100 services to lots of different firms? Or do you want to offer 6 services? And if they don't want it, then you say goodbye to them. So that's, in other words, you're going from the knowledge management, reflecting back up to your strategy. And that happens with everything else. That happens with marketing and people. As soon as you start to delve into a process, you'll start to be challenged with quite difficult questions from the strategic perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you triggered me as well there, Joe, that, I think, in a way, very, very few firms are at the pure brains end of Meister's spectrum, and you've already illustrated, certainly a lot of the strategists are less so, now, but in almost like a normal distribution, a lot of firms clump into that grey hair model. We offer value because we've done this many times before, and the massive, point I would make here is that, for those kind of firms where you've got remotely kind of repeatable procedural kind of approach, is if you don't have some investment in a structured, body of reference there, then do not talk about being a learning organization, because unless you've got a reference point, which is in the middle of your town square that you can gather around and say, well, at this point in time, this is the best embodiment we have of, X thousand years of practice is this. And at least it gives us a language and an ontology that you can sort of then talk to and adapt and improve. It's never ended. It's always kind of evolving. But, I think for me, it's so linked to a learning organization. If you don't have a reference point, you don't talk about, continuous improvement. It's a soundbite. Yeah.
Yes, agreed.
The other, I guess, key piece here is, enablers. We see often that, I feel for a lot of sort of knowledge managers are sort of slightly lost in the organization. They may have been brought in on the remit of a very engaged, sort of enlightened, senior exec, and that person's moved on, and, they're sort of, they're passionate, but they're operating without real understanding. Can't emphasize enough, it has to come with, the exec genuine buy-in and alignment, not just a piece of rhetoric, but, it has to start there. I'm sure you've seen some.
Yes. Yeah. And, well, I'm sure we'll move on to disruptors shortly, but, this is a key area where I'm starting to see AI have an impact, and, we'll cover this in more detail later, but what most firms have been offering or doing. I've noticed some people in the chat started to talk about the opportunities for AI.
Well, go for some of it, Joe. We're already over the half hour point. So, and just as an aside, Joe, I know you're writing a book on AI in professional services. So I know it's a very we should definitely tap into your expertise. Just as a sidebar. We've got him in the waiting room at least, but my colleague who leads the sort of machine learning AI development on our side, and currently doing his PhD in this area, is on hand. So if it kind of goes there, we might ask Mark to drop in for a few minutes just to give an oversight of some of the work he's engaged. But Joe, I'd love to get your thoughts. Just what is all of this about to be totally thrown up in the air? Are we at the sort of cusp of what Thomas Kuhn might say is a paradigm shift? What's your high-level thoughts on where we're heading?
Yeah, yes. I guess I think we are overestimating the impact of AI in the short term, but I think we're also underestimating it in the long term, and especially in consulting. Now, unlike some bodies of knowledge, and this goes back to your points about ontology and philosophy, Dom, expertise around organizations is a very clumsy, imprecise, and ontologically difficult subject matter to do interventions on. And that's because, unlike the law or unlike even the body, you can't do experiments. You know, every organization is completely different in a different context, different drivers, different structures, different leaders. Whereas, the body or the law or a set of accounts are all fairly similar, give or take. And so this is one reason why consulting interventions have a high failure rate, is because what worked with client X won't necessarily work with client Y. Much more so than, say, drugs and the body. So what I'm seeing in professional firms generally is a lot of AI starting to replace the actual work that is being done by the experts. So you're getting AI doing better cancer scanning than doctors, prescribing better than doctors, understanding symptoms better than doctors. You're looking at contracts being written better than lawyers, AI passing the bar exam, or AI doing accounts better, more accurately, reconciling spreadsheets better. It's not doing so well when it comes to management advice, thank God, I suppose, is the first thing to say. But the second thing is that doesn't mean that internally there aren't huge opportunities that are only going to get better when it comes to either improving the quality of service or cutting costs, typically by getting rid of juniors and replacing them with agents that can do the work that previously they would have done. So that's my kind of high level view. I'm happy to dive into.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I think I broadly agree. I sort of definitely would say the sort of the hype of the short-term impact is invariably going to be overplayed. But do we fully understand where this is going? Down the line. I don't think anybody's got their heads remotely around that. I think. In some ways aligned to kind of where we sit, just with respect to where our platform's building out. In some ways, there's tactical. As an interesting learn for us over the last 12 months, we spent a lot of time helping clients build their IP, and that was a very manual process. Even up to 12 months ago. I think this is still fairly tactical AI, but where you use AI integrated, sensibly into your task. It's just a task efficiency piece. We kind of conservatively say now it's 5 times faster to help to build, very, very high quality playbooks as it would have been, previously. Yeah. I think operationally moving to the next bound, it's where AI, you're using it as an intelligent assistant effectively, do this task, produce this kind of insight, this report, and it just produces that. And then at the more strategic end, it's a little bit where signposted my colleague Mark working on is the sort of how it might get involved in facilitating genuine lesson learned type, kind of disciplines, which, let's be honest, are not much more than sort of fairly moribund corporate theatre, really.
Yes.
So I think broadly aligned. I wonder if this is what we're doing for time. So we've got 20 minutes. I wonder, if we go to more plenary Q&A, maybe just on that last point, it's maybe a bit of a segue. Mark, if you don't mind coming on for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll kind of get to the more the questions in the chat there. And please kind of put them in. But Mark, obviously we have to keep this very short. But
sure.
This is a big topic actually. Let me just give 30 seconds if people are interested. This is completely in our R&D bucket really, but we're really interested in about how this continuous learning, knowledge management aspects of lessons learned, particularly as it pertains to sort of large-scale capital delivery programs, can be potentially radically enabled with machine learning. We've written a white paper on that. We've put out a high-level overview. Again, I'm sure my colleague will put it up on chat. But one component, and it's only one of several, and all would have to be done in very, very close integration, is the ingestion of knowledge into any kind of learning system. And Mark, over to you. If you could kind of give us a quick sort of sense of where your prototypes are going in that regard.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just quickly start sharing. So this is, as Dom was saying, for our kind of whole lessons learned Vision, this is just one aspect of it in terms of how do you improve the quality of a lesson as it's being captured. And as when we've spoken about this in the past, I think everyone can relate to this. You get to the end of a project, you save a lesson, or you ask your team to sort of record lessons learned, and everyone gives a 1 or 2 sentence, vague, not particularly actionable lesson. So this is just our vision of how this might work better in the future. So just give you a quick example, this is a sort of chatbot that's integrated into this project within MethodGrid. And I'm just going to put this lesson here, and this is an example of the sort of low quality, vague lesson we're just talking about. The actual lesson doesn't matter too much, but just about, I'm saying that it was difficult to integrate the new system into some existing infrastructure on a rail project. Doing it in phases helped, and that's not particularly useful. But what we're hoping to see here, and we start to see what the system's going to do, it's going to take that lesson as a starting point, and instead of just saving that vague lesson as it is, it's going to start asking me some questions, challenge me to get a bit more specific. So it's asking me if we can dive a bit deeper. Could you share more about why it was a challenge? So I'll say there were incompatibilities between the new system and existing infrastructure. I spelled infrastructure wrong, but I think it's clever enough to know what I mean. And again, this is just, it's going to keep asking me for more and more detail until it feels like it's at a point where it's got enough information, there's enough specific actionable details for it to actually save this lesson. I understand that this project is about rail upgrades. So this is an interesting point to bring up as well. It's aware of the context of this conversation. It knows that we're having a conversation about this grid, this project. I haven't mentioned what I'm talking about, but it's sort of picked that up from context. So it's asking me some follow-up questions. It's asking who took the lead in this process, what phase of the project this occurs. So I'll say, I'm slightly making this up for demo purposes. I'm going to say we called in electrical specialists, and they noticed the issue, but it delayed the project. And you can just see here, hopefully this is through demonstrating the point here, rather than just accepting this sort of vague, not very useful lesson, a quick back and forth. We start to get a lot more detail, a lot more specific. What phase of the project was the challenge encountered? I'll say we only noticed after the project had started. It would have been better to notice earlier. And I'm rifling through this fairly quickly just for the sake of a demo. So here we go. It's now giving us an outline of the lesson we've got. So it's got the challenge, and again, it's bringing in some context about the grid, but it knows about what the different phases of this project are. It's given us a lesson, it's given us a recommendation, and we can carry on the conversation at this point, refine it, but for now I'm just going to say, yes, please save that. And hopefully this is demonstrating the point that we started off with a fairly vague, not particularly actionable lesson. Through back and forth dialogue, we kind of drilled down and we've ended up in a place with a lot more detail, a lot more action. As Dom said at the start, this is just one phase of this whole kind of lessons learned pipeline. And you can see it's saved it here. So this is saved into our lessons learned repository, which will then be searchable, or it'll be surfaced at a relevant time later on. I think that's it demo-wise. I'm sure there's more. Thank you, Mark. A lot more to say about this. I'm aware we don't have it there quite.
Stay on the stage in case that does. Yeah, but I mean, again, this is just part of a R&D effort we're involved in with a number of our key clients, and we see it sort of 12-18 months before it gets anywhere close to a sort of working prototype. But just I think a really nice little glimpse of how some sort of neural linguistic processing, sort of Socratic dialogue, helps you go from what can be hugely varied human guff that often ends up in sort of these repositories to something that's tuned to tuned to utility, and particularly, and I think where the research is going to have to get to is that it captures as much context as is relevant, such that a behavioural trigger down the line can spot enough contextual kind of similarity to sort of play it back. And that's still the challenge, is how you get it to really facilitate you to a rich contextual understanding of that piece of information. But yeah, big topic. We should open this up for another grid talk down the line. But yeah, stay online. Thank you, Mark. Let's take
definitely, and there'll be more. Just very quickly, there'll be more about this at the live grid talk we're doing next month. So there'll be a lot more time for that there. Yeah,
no, thank you. A couple of questions. Let's start. At least address some of these. So, Joe, do you want to take the first one, which is from Paul? Is the future of consulting with AI and consulting to develop as recommendation engines? I've heard you talk about some really interesting stuff about the digital twin of yourself, almost.
Yes.
Yeah, I love. Yeah.
Yeah. So philosophically, I don't think that AI can reproduce strategic advisory consulting. I'm not going to die on that hill, though. In terms of a couple of things I've done for my clients. One, because I've probably written 1 million words on the consulting industry. If you add in my blogs to my books to various other bits and pieces, articles, put all of that into an AI bot. I've also then transcribed every podcast I've done with someone, both as a guest and as an interviewer, and every webinar I've run. I've also transcribed all the lectures I've done, and I've put all of that in. So it's a RAG model in effect, which isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. And if any of my clients have a question that they don't want to pay me for, or they think it's a 5-minute thing, I don't want an hour with Joe, then they use that, and the feedback has been very good. The second thing I've done, which is similar to what Mark's done, is create a bot that provides feedback on proposals. So in effect, I'll ask them, number one, what's the RFI or RFP? What do you know about the client? Put their website in so that you can have a language check, and then upload your proposal, and it will literally go through the document and give you suggestions in red of how it can be improved. And the feedback on that, even though it's a relatively simple thing to do, the feedback on that has been remarkable. A few people have said it's like having me in the room with them, which might be an insult to me, but I think it's a compliment to the machine. So this idea of digital twin is quite powerful for 2 reasons. Number one, it focuses the mind on the content that's available out there that perhaps you're not capturing. So I'm a big fan of recording and transcribing every meeting that you are allowed to record and transcribe, then using that as the basis for input into some type of AI. The second reason is because generalized large language models have a challenge when it comes to doing specific personality types very in a lot of detail. One way around that is for us to create, in effect, specific task chatbots, and they perform much better if you focus them on specific tasks. So you might train something up. You might, for example, have 10 chatbots that your organization has access to, one to review PowerPoints or create PowerPoints, one to do proposals, one to do analysis of data or whatever. So that's something I'm very much interested in for my clients, but I'm also interested in terms of saving me time.
Yeah, no, fascinating. RAG models, Mark, keep me honest here. Retrieval augmentation generation. I think it's so for those less familiar, that's the ability to take very common large language models and effectively sort of add your own sort of knowledge grounding sourcing on top. And that's also where we see platforms like ours going, which is the ability, you say as an organization, well, we lean to this methodology, we lean to this body of knowledge, possibly even ingest all of your previous proposals and engagement deliverables and so forth, and it augments the the large language models that are out there. And yeah, Joe, just another point on that. I do think there's an interesting bit as to how this plays out with management consultancy firms that are on pure sort of strategy analysis, ultimately really enabled, you can imagine that becoming quite with AI, as opposed to sort of more transformation, which I think is still, largely defensible, that it's by its nature very human. You have to take people with you. There's a hearts and minds. There's a very human kind of communication part of that. You need leadership. You need energy. I think, I wonder if there's an interesting sort of bifurcation there. But I'm going to keep moving. Alex's question: how do you ensure good knowledge management practices are actually performed by employees, particularly when you have different ways of working and different styles between different employees? Do you want to go first? I've got a perspective.
You go first, Dom, because I think you'll have seen this more often than I will have.
Yeah, and I think it's a great thing. And I think it's part of a deliberate knowledge management strategy that has this wired into it. For me, is that it's really rewarded. And we made sure, certainly in my Moorhouse days, that as part of the sort of articulation of competency framework, and how you move from one grade to the next, is your active participation in collective knowledge build. And we used to do a lot of 360. So we made it explicit that it was a kind of a part of the the behavioral journey that helped you move up the firm. We'd also do a lot of 360 at the point of performance kind of appraisal, and really to understand who's almost doing it silently in the margins. Back to this socialization point, it was always really interesting to me to hear Trevor is always doing it late of an evening. If I need a piece of knowledge, or he wants help here, he will dig something out from his sort of toolbox, and that sort of, again, social aspect. And as importantly, spending time at the end of a busy engagement to feed back into the the corporate realm. And let's be honest, a lot of people will say, well, we don't have time, I've got to jump from this client to the next. But actually the best consultants do find time. They just manage to juggle both these aspects. But the important bit as a professional service firm leader is that's rewarded and recognized. Would be one high level point.
Yep, agreed on all of that. I think the people side of things is important in every aspect of the firm. Creating a culture. I'm a bit reluctant to say you can always make time, because I experience firms that the utilization rate is 95%, sometimes 120%, depending who you are. And that's clearly something that needs to be looked at if you're going to take knowledge management seriously. So I'm having a discussion with one of my clients at the moment whether they could drop their EBITDA, which is currently running at 32%, drop it down to 30%, capture some of the knowledge, build your IP, encourage your people to do that, because at the moment everyone's sprinting. They're probably going to lose people, but they're also not capturing all that experience that's going to lead to the long-term value of the firm.
Joe, that's a really fair challenge. And actually, I've just gone back in history. When I did that strategy for Deloitte practice at the time, one of the aspects I looked at was the question of how much time are we all as a team spending with the ability to invest back into IP and knowledge management. And from all the timesheet data, it averaged out at 1.3%. I remember that figure. And actually at the time, we were looking at best practice exemplars. I mean, admittedly, probably more in the product world. So 3M at the time was a very, oft-cited, benchmark product base, but, hugely innovative. They were very deliberate. 15% is the minimum. We want all of our teams to be involved in, IP generation. And, again, there's a difference between PS firms and product businesses, but I think, Joe, where your point is going also is a really false economy when firms kind of keep, up in the utilization target.
Yep.
And, it's such a net negative effect if you haven't got residual allocated time, to knowledge management, IP generation. Almost an equal sin to be overlooked.
Yes.
Is to be underutilized.
Yeah, agreed.
So yeah, you're right. There's real kind of corporate leadership sort of culture set in there. Do you want to take on? I think we've got let's have a look. If you want to choose one.
Where are we? Rachel asks, we need to look at what is the basis for content that AI is using. Do we own that content, the copyright? Okay, so someone's given an answer to that, have they?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's an internal.
Right, okay. Oh, sorry.
I think so. I need to look at it close. One other one from Paul is, should we be separating method knowledge in terms of how it can help me do a task and how it can help me to understand to make a decision?
Yeah. I think this is a really important point, and I think there's a further separation around innovation, because the risk with standard approaches to knowledge management is that you codify nothing, you codify everything, and then you don't innovate sufficiently because you're tweaking a few documents and standard operating procedures. And I think knowledge management done well is number one, codifying, the method. But there's other important things. How do we make decisions in the firm? Can we make them faster? How do we innovate in the firm? Can we innovate better? And I think those are the more difficult challenges, especially now AI has come along and is doing so well at, reflecting on the codified stuff. I think the innovation is, and the decision making is a key part of that.
Yeah, and I think in a way that gives me hope for the sort of medium term, Joe, for PS firms, in that well, I think it's going to sort of separate out the kind of the commodity, fairly low value player to the high value player. It's going to it's going to sort of squeeze out from the middle, but the more high value end of offer is actually helping our clients navigate this world and build their sort of capabilities with respect to the impact AI is going to have on their businesses. We're always meta, aren't we? We're sort of at the we're going to have a lot of work to do, which I think is going to be multiple years for the best practices out there, advising our clients. Indeed, we're under Mark and our PS team, we're doing a lot of that really, which is how does AI impact your strategy, and how can we help you tune AI models to your to your best effect. I think we've got time maybe for or maybe not actually. I'm going to call it there, guys.
Okay.
We do like bringing it in on time. If there's anything that's particularly interesting now, sort of we'll maybe get to it after the call. But just to sort of bring us to a close, I mean, Joe, I don't know if you wanted to. I've just literally got a couple of final points, but did you want to say anything in closing, Joe?
No, only I need to update my photo to one where I've got no hair. Yes, I miss those days.
Everybody can see the contrast there, yeah. I think I'm probably guilty of a slightly younger photo. So a couple of, again, just final closing points. The spirit of this is very much knowledge share. I think, hugely fortunate to have somebody with Joe's experience today. So again, Joe, huge thanks. Really would, say to people we should go and track Joe's content down his LinkedIn, etc. A few other sort of in the spirit of just sharing resources. The Pace Digital, which was the methodological build we did for Network Rail, is actually uniquely a publicly accessible resource. So for anybody in the rail industry, just be aware of it. It's publicly accessible, and again, I'm sure a link will go up. If you were interested in the white paper, lessons learned, again, drop us a note. There's another one that colleagues wrote on just playbook build and best practice we've observed in that area. Really recommend that one. Again, let us know, drop it in chat. Rail industry, for those of you in the rail industry, I think Pip and our colleagues is at the Innovation Conference next week. Come over and say hello to us if you're there. I'd love to have a chat. And in fact, RIA, the industry body, is also running a number of briefings on the work Network Rail have done. So again, just point you to their website. Final remind, GRIDtalk Live in April, still places. So let us know if you'd like to join that throng. Otherwise, I think I am in closing territory. 1 minute to Joe. Thank you, sir. I knew.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Limited prep, but very engaged exchange. So thank you, and good luck with the book. Let us know when it comes out. We'll let
Thank you.
friends know. Good afternoon, everybody. Great weekends.
Bye-bye.